She was supposed to be dead. The stagecoach went off the cliff at Dead Man's Elbow on a November night in 1883. Everyone said so. The driver said so. The man who ordered it said so. But deep in the Bitterroot Mountains, something impossible was happening. A woman with a broken leg was crawling through a blizzard toward a light she could not explain. And the man who found her a ghost with a federal badge and 5 years of silence behind him was about to discover that she had not survived the crash by accident. She had survived it because she knew something that could destroy the most powerful man in Montana. And now that man was coming for her. This is a story about what happens when the wrong turn leads to the right person, and what two broken people can build together when they stop running. Welcome to our channel, where the frontier comes alive through stories of grit, love, loyalty, and the fierce courage of ordinary people in extraordinary times. Remember this: the people who seem the most lost are sometimes exactly where they need to be. If this story speaks to you, hit that like button and subscribe. Every listen, every share, every comment tells us you want more stories like this one. We are just getting started.
I had not spoken to another living soul in 217 days. I know this because I carved a mark into the pine beam above my door every morning, the way a prisoner marks his cell. I was not a prisoner. I told myself this. I told myself a great many things up there on that mountain. Most of them were lies. The cabin sat at 7,000 feet on the eastern face of the Bitterroot Range, where the air was thin enough to make a man lightheaded if he moved too fast and cold enough to kill him if he stopped moving at all. I had built it with my own hands 5 years ago, after Daniel died, and after I decided that the world below the tree line had taken everything it was going to take from me. The walls were hand-hewn pine. The roof was sod and timber. The hearth was stone I had hauled up from the creek bed, one rock at a time. It was not comfortable. It was mine. In those years, that was the same thing. My mornings followed a fixed order. Coffee first, black, boiled in an iron pot that had survived more than I had. Then Daniel's notebook, the small leather-bound one with the cracked spine, read for 10 minutes before I locked it back in the box under my bunk. I had read those pages so many times I could have recited them in my sleep. I was not reading them for information. I was reading them to keep Daniel alive in the only way left to me. Then the trap line. Then firewood. Then whatever the mountain required. I cataloged the Bitterroot the way I used to catalog suspects. East Ridge, 3 elk, 1 limping, would not last the winter. South tree line, wolf pack moving closer than last week, which meant the deer were thinning. North slope, nothing. Nothing had been nothing for 5 years, which was exactly how I wanted it. My name is Elias Calloway. I was once a United States Marshal, the lead investigator of the federal district, the man they sent when the case was too complicated or too dangerous for ordinary channels. I was good at the work. I was better at it than I was at most things that mattered, which is probably why I lost everything that mattered in the end. But that is a longer story. It starts with a smell. On the morning of my 217th day of silence, I was checking the north trap line when I smelled smoke from the wrong direction. Not wood smoke from a hearth. Something sharper, fresher. The smell of a fire that had happened recently and was now dying. I stopped. In 5 years, nothing had come from the north face. The north face was sheer rock and bad footing, and a switchback trail that the locals called Dead Man's Elbow because 3 wagons had gone off it in the past decade, and none of the passengers had walked away. It was not a route anyone chose. I adjusted the strap of my Winchester and turned my snowshoes toward the smell. I found the wreck 40 minutes later. The stagecoach had left the trail at the worst possible point, where the switchback curved sharply over a 200-foot drop to the ravine below. It had not simply tipped. It had launched, the way things launch when something catastrophic happens to an axle at speed. The coach was a splintered skeleton on its side in the snow, one wheel still turning slowly in the wind. I did not rush down. I stopped at the ridge line and read the scene the way I had been trained to read scenes, and what I read made the back of my neck go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. The axle had not failed. I could see it from where I stood. The brake was too clean, too specific. An axle that fails from wear fractures unevenly. This one had been cut most of the way through, enough to hold on flat ground, guaranteed to snap under the lateral stress of a sharp mountain curve. This was not an accident. I descended carefully. The man visible through the coach window was dead, neck at an angle that left no question. I found an older woman 50 yards further down the slope, thrown clear of the wreck, also dead. I checked both. I kept moving. No driver, one horse missing. The snow showed boot prints walking away from the wreck, not toward it. Someone had survived this crash, unhitched a horse, and left. Then I found the drag marks. A trail of disturbed snow led from the wreck toward a cluster of boulders 30 yards east, where the rock face offered a narrow cut of shelter from the wind. Someone had pulled themselves there. Someone who had been alive after the crash and had enough presence of mind to move toward cover. I followed the trail. She was curled in the space between two boulders, half buried in drifted snow, wearing a traveling coat that was entirely wrong for Montana in November. Wool, city weight, the kind of coat that was adequate for Boston winters and useless here. I knelt beside her, touched her neck, ice cold, but there beneath the cold, a pulse, faint as a candle in wind but present. Her left leg was broken. I could see it even through the layers of skirt, the unnatural angle that meant a bad break. If I left her here, she would be dead in 20 minutes. Exposure would finish what the crash had started. I looked at her face, bruised along the left cheekbone, a cut at the hairline still seeping sluggishly in the cold, auburn hair frozen at the ends. And even unconscious, even half buried in snow and dying, she had a set to her jaw that I recognized. She had dragged herself to shelter with a broken leg. She had not given up and waited to die. I almost walked away. I will be honest about that. Taking her in meant choosing a side in something I did not yet understand. It meant ending 5 years of careful invisibility. It meant becoming involved. Then I saw two things that changed my calculation. The first was a brass map tube tucked inside her coat, held against her body with one arm, even in unconsciousness. I recognized the maker's stamp on the cap. It was from a surveyor's supply house in Boston, one I had encountered in Daniel's files 5 years ago. The second was a folding knife in the lining of her sleeve. Small, well-maintained, the kind of knife that a working person carries as a tool and occasionally as a last resort. Not a woman's decorative knife, a serious one. She had not come to Montana to be rescued. Whatever she was doing on that coach, she had planned for what came after it. I made my decision. I unclasped my bearskin cloak and wrapped it around her. She weighed almost nothing. I lifted her carefully, her head falling against my chest, and began the long climb back up to the cabin. The brass map tube I tucked inside my own coat. I would think about that later. She came back to consciousness the way a wildcat comes out of a trap, all fury and instinct, no gratitude whatsoever. I respected that more than I wanted to. Her first movement was to reach for the knife that was no longer in her sleeve. Her second was to scan the room, and I watched her do it. Exits, weapons on the wall, the door bar, my size, the distance between us. She completed the assessment in under 10 seconds and then went very still, which told me she had concluded that open panic was not useful. Elias said from the chair across the room where he had been sitting for the past 3 hours, "The knife is on the shelf. You can have it back when I know who you are." She looked at him. Green eyes, he noted, the color of pine in summer. They were doing the same thing her scan of the room had done, moving over him with professional thoroughness. She said, "Where am I?" "My cabin, north face of the Bitterroot, about 4 miles from where I found you." "The others?" It was not a question. He answered it anyway. The man in the window was gone when I arrived. The woman downslope. I checked both. She absorbed this. Something moved across her face, grief compressed into a single instant, and then put somewhere internal. "The driver," she said. "No body. One horse missing. Boot prints walking away from the wreck." Her jaw tightened. "He left us." "Yes. He was alive." He looked at me and rode away. She stopped. Then, carefully, he said something. Before he left, he said, "Sterling said no survivors, clean break." Elias went very still. She looked at him. "You know that name?" "I know a lot of names," Elias said. "Rest now. Your leg is set and splinted, but you need to stay still or you'll undo the work." "I need to get to Missoula. You need to not move that leg. Missoula can wait." She studied him for a moment with those precise green eyes. Then she said, "You have law books on that shelf, federal survey maps on the table, and there is a badge under that cloth on the second shelf that you did not hide well enough." He said nothing. "Who are you?" she asked. "The man who carried you up a mountain in a blizzard," Elias said. "That will have to be sufficient for now." She considered this. Then she lay back, which he understood was not capitulation but strategy. She was filing him away the way he had filed away the map tube for later examination. He brought her willow bark tea and made her drink it. She did without complaint, which told him she understood the necessity even if she did not like the taste. Over the next 3 days, she performed helplessness with moderate conviction. She asked for small things, moved carefully, kept her questions to a minimum. He allowed it. He understood what she was doing. A wild thing needs time to determine that the cage door is open before it will risk walking through. Meanwhile, he observed. She noticed everything. Her eyes tracked the room differently than most people's eyes tracked a room. Most people looked at objects. She looked at relationships between objects. The distance from the door to the rifle on the wall. The angle of the window to the fire. The gap under the door that would show light from outside. It was the way a surveyor looks at terrain, reading the negative spaces as carefully as the positive ones. On the second night, he caught her watching him read Daniel's notebook. She did not look away when he caught her. She simply shifted her gaze to the ceiling, as if she had been looking there all along. But for 3 seconds before she shifted, she had been staring at the cover of the notebook with an expression he could not immediately name. Not curiosity, something closer to recognition. He locked the notebook away. He sat for a long time watching the fire. In the morning, he made a decision. He put the brass map tube on the table between them. He said, "This fell from your coat when I picked you up. I have not opened it." She looked at the tube, then at him. Something shifted in her face. The performance of helplessness dropped, cleanly and completely, the way a curtain drops at the end of an act. She sat up straighter against the wall. She looked at him with her actual face for the first time. She said, "My name is Clara Ashford. My father was Edmund Ashford. He was a federal surveyor for 30 years. She paused. "I think you should tell me your name before I tell you the rest." "Elias Calloway." She was quiet for 3 seconds. "I know that name," she said. Her voice had changed. "Most people in the territory do," he said, "usually not in a good way." "No," she said slowly. "I know it from my father's papers. He wrote about a marshal named Calloway. He said you were the most honest man in the federal system." She looked at him steadily. "He also said you were dead." Elias looked at the map tube on the table between them. "Rumors," he said. "Tell me about the tube." On the 3rd day, she stopped performing helplessness entirely. She asked for paper and pencil, ostensibly to write a letter. He brought them. He watched her begin to sketch, and what she sketched was not a letter. It was a topographical outline of the valley visible from the cabin window, rendered from memory and a single glance through the glass. It was accurate to within 50 yards. He knew because he had walked that valley 100 times. She was not what she had initially appeared to be. He had suspected this from the knife. The map confirmed it. Elias put his coffee down and said, "You want to tell me what you were actually doing on that coach." Clara set down the pencil. She looked at the map tube still sitting on the mantel where he had placed it. She made a decision. He could see it happen, a specific settling in her posture. The decision to spend the information because the situation required it. She said, 3 weeks before he died, my father sent me a letter. He told me he had spent the last 20 years documenting something that could destroy a very powerful man. He told me he had hidden the documentation inside a brass map tube, inside a locked freight box, aboard a specific coach leaving Helena on November 14th. She paused. He told me what was on those maps. He told me that Garrison Whitmore knew about them. And he told me that Whitmore's men were looking. Elias said, Whitmore, did you? Yes. Senator Garrison Whitmore. The same. Elias was quiet for a moment. He said, You did not book that coach to meet Whitmore. No. I booked it to intercept the freight box at the Midway station. I was going to transfer to a different coach and take the maps to a federal judge in Missoula. She looked at him. The axle broke before the Midway station. He stood up. He walked to the window and stood looking out at the snow for a long time. Behind him, Clara said, The driver knew my name. He knew about a scar on my left palm. He knew specific things that only someone in Whitmore's circle would know. Elias turned around. He said, Your father's name was Edmund Ashford. Yes. The surveyor. Yes. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said carefully, I need you to prepare yourself for something. She went very still. He told her. 2 years ago, he had found Edmund Ashford on the North Pass Trail, shot through the side, barely alive in the early November snow. He had carried him back to this cabin. He had kept him alive for 4 days with willow bark and whiskey and whatever warmth the hearth could provide. Edmund had talked through the fever, about the maps, about Whitmore, about a daughter in Boston he had not written to in 8 months because he was afraid his letters were being read. Edmund Ashford had died in this bed, in this cabin 2 years ago. Clara said nothing. The fire popped and settled. Wind moved against the walls. He said, He gave me something in his last lucid hour, a letter. He asked me to find a way to get it to you. I did not know your name. I did not know how to find you. I have been keeping it. He went to the locked box under the bunk. He came back with an envelope sealed, Clara's name written on the front in a cramped leftward hand. He set it on the bed beside her. He put on his coat and went outside. He sat on the porch in the snow for 20 minutes. The cold was absolute and clean and asked nothing of him, which was what he needed. When he came back inside, Clara was sitting exactly as he had left her. The letter was open in her lap. Her face was dry. She was looking at the fire with an expression he recognized as someone who has finished crying in private and is now deciding what comes next. She looked up at him. She said, He said you were the most honest man in the federal system. He was generous. He said that if I ever found myself in real trouble on the frontier, a man named Elias Calloway would be worth trusting. She looked down at the letter again. He wrote this 2 years ago. He knew you were up here. He knew where I was hiding, Elias said. He never told anyone. No, Clara said. He wouldn't. She folded the letter once, carefully, and tucked it inside her shirt against her skin. He kept your secret for 2 years with a bullet in his side and Whitmore's men watching him. She looked up. I think that earns you my full story. She told him everything then. Edmund's 20 years of documentation, the forged boundary surveys, Whitmore's systematic theft of land across the Northern Territory, the federal judge in Missoula who had agreed to hear the evidence, the plan to intercept the freight at the Midway station. She told it plainly, without decoration, the way people tell the truth when they are too tired to manage the lie any longer. When she finished, Elias sat down across from her. He looked at the map tube on the mantel. He looked at her. He said, Whitmore is running for territorial governor. I know. He cannot afford this evidence to reach a federal judge. I know that too. She looked at him steadily. That is why that driver left me in the snow. Yes. He leaned forward. Clara, if Whitmore ordered no survivors on that coach, he is not going to stop looking. When no one reports back to him, he will send more men. She said, Then we do not have much time. He almost smiled at that. He almost. He stood instead and went to put more wood on the fire. He said with his back to her, Before you were found, did you have time to ask yourself why your father sent the maps on a freight coach instead of directly to the judge? She said, he thought his mail was being watched. And why this specific coach, this specific date? A pause. He knew I would come, she said slowly. He knew I would come looking for him when he stopped writing. He calculated when I would arrive. He put the maps on the coach he knew I would book if I came through Helena. Another pause. He planned for me to find them. He was protecting the maps until I could reach them. Elias turned around. He looked at her. He said, "Your father was a very deliberate man." "Yes," she said quietly. "He was." There was a long silence. Outside, the blizzard pressed against the walls. Inside, the fire burned and the coffee went cold, and neither of them moved. Then Clara said, "Elias, what do you know about Garrison Whitmore?" He looked at her for a moment. He looked at the box under his bunk. He looked back at her. He said, "More than most people, less than I should." He paused. "I think it is time I told you about my brother." She found the badge on the 4th day. She was searching the medicine cabinet for more willow bark, moving more confidently on her splinted leg. And she found the false back panel. Behind it, a United States Marshal's badge, a federal identification card 5 years out of date, and a wanted poster with his own face on it. The charge read, "Desertion of federal duty and failure to appear for disciplinary proceedings." She brought it to the table and set it down without comment. He looked at it. He looked at her. He sat down. He said, 5 years ago, I was the lead marshal for the Federal Northern District. I had been building a case against Garrison Whitmore for 2 years. Land fraud, bribery of public officials, and 3 deaths that I could connect to him with enough evidence to take to trial. She listened. She did not interrupt. My partner was a man named Rex Dolan. We had worked together for 6 years. I trusted him the way you trust a man who has been beside you in dangerous situations long enough that the trust becomes automatic. He stopped. He made himself continue. The night we were set to make the arrest, Rex shot me. From behind. Outside Whitmore's property line, far enough from help that I should have died. Close enough to cover that I was able to drag myself into the tree line. Clara said, "How long?" 3 days, before Daniel found me. Daniel was your brother. My brother. He was a lawyer in Helena. He had been helping me build the case, handling the documentary evidence, keeping it somewhere Whitmore could not reach. He looked at the badge. I chose to stay dead. I chose it deliberately because I knew that if I surfaced, Whitmore would know I had survived and Daniel would become the target. He stopped again. 6 months later, Daniel was dead anyway. His office burned. The sheriff called it an accident. The cabin was very quiet. Clara said, "You disappeared to protect your brother, and he died anyway." It was not an accusation, it was just the shape of the truth, laid flat. The most devastating thing anyone had said to him in 5 years. And she had said it without malice, simply because it was accurate. He said, "Yes." "And you stayed up here because Charleston and because I had failed at everything else." She was quiet for a moment, then she picked up the badge from the table. She held it in both hands, feeling the weight of it. She set it back down carefully. She said, "My father spent 20 years drawing those maps, knowing Whitmore would eventually come for him. Your brother walked into his office every morning knowing Whitmore was watching him. They did not stop." She looked at him. "The question is not whether it matters. It clearly matters. The question is whether you are ready to let it matter again." He had no answer to that, which in his experience meant the question was the right one. That night he told her about Daniel, the person, not the case or the files or the death. He told her about a man who sang hymns with entirely the wrong words and was terrified of large spiders and made terrible coffee and absolutely brilliant legal arguments. He told her about a man who laughed easily and worked late and believed genuinely and without cynicism that the law was worth something. Clara listened with her whole attention. Toward the end, she laughed, once, small, surprised out of her by something he said about Daniel's approach to opposing counsel. It was the first time he had made someone laugh while talking about Daniel instead of just surviving the talking about Daniel. He filed away the sound of her laughing the way he used to file away evidence, carefully, in a place he could find again. He said, "Your shoulder is worse than I thought. The joint needs to be manipulated or you will lose range of motion." She looked at him levelly. She said, "Tell me what you need me to do." He told her. She turned her back to him and pulled her collar aside without hesitation. He worked carefully and thoroughly, and she breathed through it without making a sound, one hand gripping the bed frame hard enough to leave marks in the wood. When he finished, he left his hand on her shoulder 1 moment longer than necessary. He removed it. He stepped back. She pulled her collar up and did not turn around immediately. He used those seconds to reassemble the version of himself that did not notice the temperature of a person's skin or the specific rhythm of someone breathing through pain. The reassembly took longer than it should have. He was out of practice. She turned around. She said in a perfectly ordinary voice, "Thank you." He said, "Try not to move it tonight." He went to make coffee. He stood at the stove with his back to her and thought about the badge on the table and about Daniel and about Rex Dolan. And then he stopped thinking about all of those things and thought instead about nothing at all, which was considerably harder than it used to be. Later, she asked him, "Is there anyone who knows you are alive?" He said, "One man. Cormac Donnelly. He runs a saloon in Copper Falls. He has kept the secret for 5 years." She nodded. She said, "We will need him." And he looked at her. She said, "We are going to need help, Elias. We cannot carry those maps to Helena and face Whitmore alone. You know that." He did know that. He had known it since she told him about the maps. He had been avoiding knowing it, which was different. He said, "I will reach out to Cormac in the morning." She said, "Good." She lay back. After a moment, she said, "I'm sorry about Daniel." He said, "Go to sleep, Clara." She did. He sat by the fire until very late, and the marks on the beam above the door counted 221 days. And for the first time in 221 days, he did not look at them before he slept. There are men who kill because they must, and men who kill because they enjoy the work. I had been the first kind once. Whitmore hired the second kind exclusively. The difference matters. But not when they are coming through your door at 2 in the morning. I was awake when they came. I am always awake at 2 in the morning. I smelled the horses before I heard the boots, and I had the Winchester in my hands, and Clara pulled from the bed and moved to the back corner before the first man hit the porch. 3 of them. I could tell by the weight distribution on the boards outside. I said to Clara quietly, "Corner, behind the woodpile, do not move until it is over." She said, "Understood." The door came in fast. The first man through caught the stock of my rifle across the face and went down hard. The second came in low and fast and tackled me into the table before I could bring the gun around. We went down together, smashing into the floor, and he was younger, and he had a Bowie knife, and he knew how to use it. The third man came through the door. And then there was a shot from across the room. Not a big sound, a small caliber crack from a short barrel. But it was accurate. The third man's gun hand dropped. He stumbled. I threw the man on top of me off, got my knee under him, and put him down with the butt of the rifle. The third man ran. I heard him hit the porch and kept running into the dark. I looked up. Clara was across the room, leaning against the far wall for support, holding a small pistol I did not recognize. Her face was the color of fresh snow. Her hands were absolutely steady. I said, "Since when?" She said, "The kitchen cabinet, 3rd day." I looked at the cabinet. I looked at her. "You found it on the 3rd day and said nothing." "I was not certain whose side you were on until the 4th day," she said. "After that, it seemed rude to mention it." I looked at the man on my floor. I looked at the open door where the third man had gone. I said, "He will ride for Whitmore. They will know by morning that you are alive and that someone is helping you." "I know," she said. She lowered the pistol. "Elias, are you hurt?" I had a gash along my ribs where the knife had caught me before I got clear. Not deep. Enough to bleed freely. She said, "Sit down." I sat. She came across the room with the medicine kit I kept on the second shelf, moving carefully on her splinted leg. She cleaned the wound with whiskey, which I took without reaction because I had been cut worse and because I was watching her face while she worked. She was focused, precise, no wasted motion. When she wrapped the bandaging, she used exactly the right tension, firm enough to hold, loose enough to breathe. I said, "Where did you learn to do this?" She said, "My father spent half his career in the field. Someone had to learn." She tied off the bandage. She looked up. We were very close. "The man who ran. How much time do we have?" 6 hours to Whitmore's nearest camp if he pushes the horse. Less if there's a relay station I do not know about. Then we need Cormac tonight. I said, "Cormac comes to me on a schedule. He will be here by dawn." She nodded. She did not move back immediately. We were still close, and the fire was low, and the cabin smelled of gunpowder and wood smoke. She said, "Thank you. For the corner. For warning me in time." I said, "You are the one who shot him. You are the one who thought to put me somewhere safe first." She looked at me steadily. "My father said the mark of a good man is not what he does for himself. It is what he does before he thinks about himself." She paused. "I think he would have liked you." I did not know what to do with that. I said, "Try to sleep. I will keep watch." She went back to the bed. She lay down and looked at the ceiling, and after a while I thought she was asleep. Then she said quietly, without turning, "Elias." "Yes." "I know what it costs to trust someone after you have been betrayed. I know you are doing it anyway." A pause. "I am not going to waste it." I sat by the fire with my rifle across my knees and thought about that for a long time. At dawn, exactly when I expected him, Cormac Donnelly knocked at the door in the specific pattern we had agreed on years ago. 2 fast, 1 slow, 2 fast. I opened it. He was enormous, Cormac, 6'3", and built like a draft horse, with red hair going gray at the temples, and a face that had been broken and reset badly at least twice. He was carrying bread and a jar of his homemade preserves and a bottle of whiskey, which was his standard visiting kit. He looked at the overturned furniture, and the blood on the floor, and the man still unconscious in the corner, with the efficiency of a man who had seen worse, and was prepared to see worse, still. Then he looked at Clara, sitting on the bed with her splinted leg extended, and her spine very straight, and the small pistol on the blanket beside her. He looked at me. He said, "Elias, you selfish man. You selfish. I have been leaving preserves on your porch for 5 years out of the goodness of my heart, and you never once thought to mention you had company." I said, "She arrived recently." He said, "She arrived and 3 of Whitmore's men arrived shortly after, by the look of it." He set the bread on the table. He looked at Clara and offered his hand. "Cormac Donnelly. I am the only friend this man has, which tells you something about the limitations of his personality." Clara said, "Clara Ashford. My father was Edmund Ashford." Cormac went still. He looked at me. I gave him a short nod. He pulled out a chair and sat down. "All right," he said. "Tell me everything. And someone make coffee because this sounds like a long conversation." It was. We talked through the morning while the blizzard built outside and the man in the corner regained consciousness, and Cormac tied him thoroughly to the chair with a length of rope from the supply shelf. The man gave us nothing useful beyond confirming that he worked for Dutch Halloway, Whitmore's head of operations, and that there were 4 more men at the camp 6 miles south. Cormac said, "There is a woman named May Hennessy. She lives 3 miles from here on the East Trail. She is the closest thing Elias has to a neighbor, and she has kept his secret for years. She has a solid house, and she is trustworthy." I said, "May is solid." Clara said, "Then that is where we go." I looked at her leg. She said, "I can ride." She could, barely, and with considerable pain that she did not mention, but she managed the 3 miles on the horse Cormac had brought. And by the time we reached May Hennessy's house, the sun was up, and the blizzard had gentled to ordinary snowfall. May came to the door before we knocked. She was 60, small and sharp-eyed, with white hair pinned back severely and the posture of a woman who had survived a great deal without losing her uprightness. She took one look at Clara and said, "Get inside. I will put water on." That was May. She healed through action. Within an hour, Clara had eaten a hot meal and changed into clean clothes, and was sitting by May's fire looking for the first time since the crash, like a person who was not operating entirely on will and adrenaline. Cormac and I sat on May's back porch with his whiskey. He said, "You look at her the way a man looks at a fire after he has been cold too long." I said, "I do not know what you are talking about." He said that you counted how many times she exhaled during breakfast. I counted you counting. He poured more whiskey. "I am not saying be foolish. I'm saying be honest with yourself before the situation forces honesty on you. Forced honesty is considerably less comfortable." He raised his glass. "Also, she is clearly remarkable, and you would be an idiot to pretend otherwise." I drank my whiskey. We sat in silence. Inside, through the window, I could see May and Clara at the kitchen table, talking in the way that women sometimes talk, with their hands busy and their words quiet. Cormac said, "What is the plan?" I said, "We need to reach Helena. The State Assembly is in session for 3 more weeks. There is a federal judge there, Judge Warren Harris, who is not in Whitmore's pocket. If we can get the maps to him with testimony to back them up, we have a case." Cormac said, "Through Black Rock Pass. It is the only road Whitmore will not be watching." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I know a woman who might help. She lives near the pass. She owes me a significant favor." He looked at me sideways. "Also, you will need Rex Dolan." The temperature on the porch dropped by several degrees that had nothing to do with the weather. I said, "No." Cormac said, "Elias." I said, "No." He said, "I know what he did. I know what it cost you. I also know that Rex Dolan has federal access that we do not have, and that without someone on the inside of the system, getting those maps to Harris is going to be considerably harder than you want it to be." He looked at me steadily. "I am not asking you to forgive him. I am asking you to use him." I stood up. I went inside. I did not answer him, but I thought about it all night. May Hennessy made the best apple pie in Bitterroot County and kept the worst secret I had ever heard. I did not know about the secret yet on the first morning. I knew about the pie. I should have paid more attention to what a person can hide inside something sweet. Clara was recovering faster than she had any right to. May's cooking had something to do with it, and the solid warmth of a proper house, and perhaps the simple relief of being somewhere that felt temporarily like safety. By the second day, she was moving through the house with something close to ease, her splinted legs still stiff, but functional. That morning, she found May in the kitchen making pie crust, and she sat at the table without being asked, and they worked side by side in the way of women who are comfortable in kitchens, May pressing dough and Clara peeling apples. May said, without looking up, "I loved a hard man once. It took him 3 years to say the word love out loud." Clara said, "What was he like?" "Quiet," May said. "Careful. The kind of man who thinks 3 times before he speaks, which means when he does speak, it is worth hearing." She worked the dough. From the very first night, no matter what room we walked into, he put himself between me and the door. Not dramatically, just there. Clara was quiet for a moment. May said, "Elias Calloway puts himself to your left. Every room, every time. You have been here 2 days." Clara said, "I noticed." May said, "Good. Women who do not notice things like that end up hurt. Men who do things like that do not know they are doing it. That is how you know it is real." They worked in silence for a while. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. That afternoon, May asked me to walk with her in the kitchen garden, still winter dead, the herb beds showing nothing but stiff brown stalks. She did not look at me when she spoke. She looked at her dead lavender. She said, "Elias." Rex Dolan is my son. The garden was very quiet. She had carried this for 5 years. I could see the weight of it in the set of her shoulders as she spoke. Rex was her son from her first marriage, raised in this county until he left at 16 to go east. She had followed his career from a distance, been quietly proud when he became a federal agent. When word reached her that I had been shot and left for dead, she had put the pieces together. She had not spoken to Rex in 5 years. She had kept me close, left the lamp burning on hard nights, kept my secret. Out of guilt. Out of the particular grief of a mother whose child has done something that cannot be undone. She said, I sent him a letter last month. When I heard that Whitmore's men were moving toward the north face, that someone was on the mountain with a woman Whitmore wanted found, I told him to come. She looked at me finally. I am not asking you to forgive him, Elias. There are things I cannot ask for. But I am asking you to hear him before you decide. There is something about what he did that has never fit what I know of him. I have lived with that doubt for 5 years. I stood in her dead garden for a long time. I thought about Daniel. I thought about 5 years of marks on a pine beam. I thought about Rex's face, the last clear image I had of it before the bullet. I said, if he comes and I do not like what he says, I will not ask your permission. She said, I know. She went back inside. I stood in the dead garden until the cold reached my bones. Then I went back in too. That night, after May had retired and Cormac had ridden back to Copper Falls on an errand he did not specify, Clara and I sat by the fire alone. She said, tell me what May told you. I looked at her. She said, she took you to the garden, and you came back looking like you had been hit with something heavy. May is not a woman who hits gently. I told her. I watched her face as I talked. She listened with that complete attention of hers, the kind that made a person feel that what they were saying was the only thing in the room. When I finished, she said, what are you going to do? I said, I do not know yet. She said, can I say something? I nodded. She said, my father made decisions alone to protect me. He stopped writing for 8 months because he was afraid his letters were being read. He died without knowing I was coming. Without knowing I would have come sooner if he had only asked. She paused. He protected me into being absent when he needed me most. I think about that every day. She was not talking about Rex, or she was talking about Rex, and also about me, and also about something larger than either of us. I said, I hear you. She said, good. She leaned back in her chair. After a moment, she said, whatever you decide about Rex, I will back it. That is not my call to make. I said, it affects you as much as it affects me. She looked at me. She said, then let us make it together. There was a long silence. I said, when this is over. She waited. I said, I want to stay below the tree line, permanently. I think I have been up on that mountain long enough. She said, I think so too. I looked at the fire. I said, I am not very good at being around people. She said, you have been reasonably adequate so far. I said, you have a low bar. She said, I have a very precise bar. You simply clear it. She stood up slowly, careful with her leg. She looked down at me. Good night, Elias. She went to her room. I sat for a long time by the fire, and outside the pines moved in the wind, and the lamp in the window burned, and I thought about bars and what it meant to clear them. I taught her to shoot properly, to read weather by the pressure in the air, to move through snow without breaking crust. What I had not planned on was what she would teach me in return. She was better than me at reading ground. She could look at a slope and tell me where the water table sat, where the soil was undermined, where the solid ground ended and the treacherous ground began. She had learned it from Edmund, who had mapped land for 30 years and passed along the knowledge the way you pass along a language so deeply embedded it became instinct. She was right about most of it. This was aggravating. I told her so. She said, "You are aggravated because you are used to being the most competent person in the room." I said, "I am aggravated because you are consistently right and you do not gloat, which somehow makes it worse." She almost smiled. She said, "My father raised me to be right about the things that matter and quiet about the things that do not. Being right about topography matters. Rubbing it in does not." On the third morning of training, I woke before dawn and found her at the kitchen table with Edmund's map spread before her, one finger tracing the survey lines in the gray pre-light. She did not know I was awake. She touched those lines the way a person touches a face they are trying to memorize. Her lips moved slightly, reading or counting, or saying something to her father that had no words. I made no sound. There are griefs that need darkness to hold them properly. And I had learned that much, but I watched her, and I understood something I had been trying not to understand. It was not protection I felt when I looked at her. It was not obligation. It was recognition. She was doing what I did with Daniel's notebook, keeping someone alive through the evidence of their work. We were the same kind of broken in the same kind of way, and that was considerably more frightening than anything else about the situation. The training continued. On the ice-walking practice behind May's house, she fell, and I caught her, one arm around her back, and we were suddenly very close in the cold air. I set her back on her feet and stepped away first. She tried again, fell again with a grace that was slightly too deliberate. I caught her the second time and held on 2 seconds longer. When I set her down, I said, "You did not fall that time, you leaned." She looked up at me with an expression of total innocence that did not fool me for a single moment. I said, "Marshall's training." She said, "You are a very perceptive man." I said, "I have been told." We were still close. The cold air moved between us and then did not. She reached up and touched the scar along my left jaw briefly with 2 fingers. Just once. Then she dropped her hand and stepped back. She said, "How long ago?" I said, "Knife fight. Before the marshal's work." I was 22 and I thought I was faster than I was. She said, "Were you?" I said, "I was fast enough, just not as fast as I thought." She said, "That seems to be a recurring theme with you." I said, "Wish, what does?" She said, "Being fast enough, just not as fast as you thought you needed to be." She looked at me steadily. "You have been punishing yourself for the gap between those 2 things for 5 years. It is a very small gap, Elias." I said, "Daniel is dead." She said, "Yes. And my father is dead. And we are both still here, which means we have something left to do." She picked up the rifle I had set down. She said, "Show me that stance again." "Esitesere." I showed her. On the 4th afternoon, we stood on May's South Ridge for the first time. The valley spreading below us, Copper Falls visible in the distance, Helena somewhere north beyond the visible range. I laid out the route, the timeline, what we needed. Clara listened. Then she looked at the valley and said, "What do you do after, when it is finished?" I said, "I do not know. First time in 5 years I cannot answer that question." She said, "Does that bother you?" I looked at her. I said, "Less than it should." She turned to face me. She said, "I have been drawing maps my whole life, marking where things are, establishing what is fixed. I do not know where I'm going after this. That is new for me." Silence. She said quietly, "It does not feel as bad as it should." She was looking at the valley. I was looking at her. And I made the decision that had been building for 3 weeks, not in a moment of impulse, but with the deliberate intention of a man who has thought too long and finally stopped thinking. I said her name. She turned. And I kissed her, in the specific way of a man who is not uncertain about what he wants, and has run entirely out of reasons to pretend otherwise. It was not desperate. It was not tentative. It was the kind of kiss that is also an acknowledgement, 2 people agreeing on something that has been true for a while. When it ended, she kept her eyes closed for a moment. Then she opened them. She said, "You took long enough." I said, "I am a methodical man. She said, "You are a stubborn man." I said, "Those are sometimes the same thing." I took her hand when we walked back. It was the first hand I had held in 5 years. It fit the way things fit when they were always supposed to. That night, for the first time, I did not count the marks on the beam. I had lost track somewhere around day 30 of her being in my life. I found I did not mind. Edmund Ashford spent 20 years drawing a map that could bring down a senator. I spent 5 years on a mountain holding my brother's notebook and calling it justice. Clara spent 24 years becoming the woman who would walk into the room and use both. Cormac recovered the brass tube from the wreck site on the 6th day. It had been buried under 3 feet of fresh snow, but the oilcloth Edmund had wrapped it in had done its work. The maps inside were intact. Clara unrolled them on May's kitchen table. They were extraordinary. 20 years of precise survey work laid over official territorial maps, with Edmund's annotations in his cramped leftward hand, showing, boundary line by boundary line, the exact nature of Whitmore's fraud. Every adjusted survey, every forged deed, every bribed official, documented with dates and measurements and the names of witnesses. We looked at it for a long time. Then I turned to the final map and found the handwritten document folded into the bottom corner. It was a contract, unsigned but dated 6 months hence, April 1884, between Garrison Whitmore and a representative of the Northern Pacific Railway. The subject was water rights, all of them. Whitmore had spent 20 years not merely stealing land. He had been consolidating control of every water source that fed the Bitterroot Valley, the rivers, the streams, the aquifer beneath the northern range. Not for cattle or farming or personal wealth. To sell the entire water supply of the Northern Territory to the railroad, which would then control water access for every farm, town, and family within a 100-mile radius. The price on the unsigned contract was $2,300,000. And at the bottom of the last map, in Edmund's hand, a list of 11 names under the heading, Men Whitmore has silenced. Number 7, Edmund Ashford. Number 9, Daniel Calloway. I looked at Daniel's name for a long time. I stood up. I went outside. Clara came after me. She did not say anything. She stood beside me in the cold, and after a while her hand found mine and she held it. That was all. After a while I said, "He did not die for nothing." She said, "No, he died for this, and we are going to make it count." I said, "Yes." We stood there until the cold became serious. Then we went back inside. I pulled May and Cormac into the kitchen, and we began planning the route. Black Rock Pass, the only trail Whitmore would not be watching. 3 days on the trail. Then Helena and the assembly chamber. Cormac said, "We will need Rex." Clara looked at me. I had spent the night before thinking about May's garden and Rex's name and what Cormac had said about useful versus forgivable. I had spent the night thinking about Daniel, about what Daniel would say if he could see me sitting on a mountain for 5 years with the evidence of Whitmore's guilt in a box under my bed. I did not think Daniel would be proud of those 5 years. I said, "Send for Rex, but I make the decisions about how we use him. And if I do not like what he tells me, the decision is mine." Cormac said, "Understood." May said, "I will send the letter today." I said to Clara, "We leave in 2 days. Can your leg manage the pass?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Be honest." She said, "I have been honest with you about everything that matters. My leg will manage the pass." She paused. "Elias, I need to tell you something." I waited. She said, "Yesterday, when you and Cormac were talking, I overheard you tell him you had already sent a message to Rex through May, before we had discussed it." The kitchen was very quiet. She said carefully, "I understand why you did it. You were protecting me from the risk of a decision I might not make the same way you would. You wanted to manage the danger before I could object to the method." She stopped. "My father stopped writing to me for 8 months for the same reason. He was afraid of what his letters might cost me. He made the decision without me." She looked at me. "He died without knowing I would have come sooner if he had only asked, Elias. He protected me into being absent when he needed me. I cannot go through that again, not with someone I... She stopped. She said, "Do not make decisions about my safety without me. I am not a liability to be managed. I am the reason we are here." The silence stretched. I said, "You are right. I am sorry. It will not happen again." She held my gaze for a moment, then she nodded. She said, "Tell me about Rex, everything you know." I told her everything. We talked until past midnight, the four of us around May's table, the maps between us like a battle plan. Before she slept, Clara rolled the maps carefully and put them back in the brass tube. She held it a moment, her father's 20 years of work in her hands. Then she set it down. I watched her let it go. I thought, that is what courage actually looks like. Not the loud version, the quiet version, the letting go. I had rehearsed killing Rex Dolan approximately 10,000 times in 5 years. I had it planned in detail, the confrontation, the accounting, the clean end of it. What I had never once rehearsed was the possibility that the story I had been telling myself was incomplete. He came out of the tree line on the second day of the pass crossing, on foot, alone, hands visible, no weapon drawn. He looked 10 years older than the last time I had seen him. He had the specific exhaustion of a man who has not slept well in a long time. I had my rifle on him before he took his second step. Clara moved to stand beside me. Not behind me, beside. Rex looked at me. He said, "I know what you want to do. I am asking you to hear me first. If you still want to afterward, I will not stop you." I said, "Talk." He talked. Rex Dolan had been working for a covert federal body for 3 years before the night he shot me. A small investigative office that operated outside the normal federal structures, because the normal federal structures were too easily compromised by men like Whitmore. They had been building a case not just against Whitmore, but against the network of officials he had corrupted. A case that would require 2 more years of embedded work to be airtight. If I had arrested Whitmore that night, the arrest would have failed within a week. Whitmore's lawyers would have dismantled the case. Every source Rex had developed over 2 years would have been burned, and Whitmore would have spent the next decade untouchable. Rex said, "I put that bullet exactly where I meant to put it. Right shoulder, clean exit, survivable with cover. I had 15 seconds to make the decision. I made it. I knew you would hate me. I decided that was acceptable. You being dead was not acceptable." I said, "Daniel." Rex was quiet. He said, "I was 20 minutes away. I had gotten word that morning. I rode hard." He stopped. He looked at me and did not look away. "I was 20 minutes too late. There is nothing I can say about that. There is nothing that makes it different from what it is. I have counted those 20 minutes every day since." The pass was very still around us. The snow muffled everything. May had said nothing since Rex appeared. She stood slightly apart. Rex looked at his mother with the look of someone who has been afraid to look at something directly for a very long time. He went to one knee in the snow. He said, "I know what you are owed from me, Ma. I know I cannot pay it. I am here because you asked, and because I owe Calloway a debt I mean to pay regardless of what he decides about me after." May looked at him for a long time. The mountain waited around all of us. Then she said, "Get up off the snow. You will ruin your knees." She put one hand on his shoulder as he stood, one hand briefly. But the way she did it carefully, like a woman handling something she had almost lost, said everything the words did not. I looked at Rex. I thought about Daniel in the notebook. I thought about the anonymous letter I had received 3 years ago, warning me not to come down from the mountain, the one I had burned because I thought it was a trap. I thought about what Clara had said about incomplete stories being the most dangerous kind. I thought about who Daniel would want me to be. I said, "You go in front, I go behind. Any deviation from the plan, and I do not ask questions first." Rex said, "Understood." I said, "We are not square. We are operational." He nodded. Clara put her hand in mine. I held it. That night we camped on the high meadow below the last ridge before Helena, and the stars were very clear, and the Bitterroot country breathed around us in the specific quiet of early spring. Clara said, "Are you all right?" I said, "Ask me in 2 days." She said, "I am asking now." I looked at the stars. I have been carrying the wrong version of that night for 5 years. That is a long time to be wrong about something that heavy. I do not know yet what to do with the right version. She lay back in the dry grass and looked up at the same sky. She said, "My father used to say that maps are not a record of what is. They are a record of where someone stood and looked and made their best guess. The guess can be wrong. The world keeps going. Someone draws a better map." I said, "That is either very comforting or very bleak." She said, "Depends on whether you are the one drawing the new map." She looked at me sideways. "I think you are." I lay down beside her. I said, "After Helena?" She said, "Yes." I said, "I am not going back up the mountain alone." She was quiet for 3 seconds. She said, "No, you are not." I looked at the stars for a long time. I thought about 217 marks on a pine beam. I tried to remember why that had seemed like enough. I could not remember. That seemed like the right answer. Helena was not ready for us. To be fair, we were not entirely ready for Helena. But Clara Ashford had spent 24 years becoming the woman who walks into a room without waiting for the room's permission. And on the morning of April 3rd, 1884, she walked into the Montana State Assembly Hall like she had been there before. The chamber was full, a formal session in progress. Garrison Whitmore stood at the front podium looking exactly as powerful men look when they believe they have won everything. Easy, measured, perfectly composed. He was speaking about the future of the territory, about water and land and progress, about the great work of civilization on the frontier. He saw Elias first. The blood left his face in a single specific instant. The composure held. He was too practiced to let it show in the room. But Elias saw it happen, and the seeing of it was a satisfaction 5 years in the making. He said smoothly to the assembled legislators, "Ladies and gentlemen, I must ask your indulgence. This man is a federal deserter. The woman beside him is the daughter of a discredited surveyor. I ask that the marshal's office remove them before this disruption continues." 2 legislators leaned forward. One reached for a clerk. The room was about to agree. Not because they were convinced. Because Whitmore was at the front and agreement was easier than doubt. Elias had seen this before. It was more dangerous than a gun. Clara walked to the central table. She did not wait for an invitation. She did not look at the legislators who were leaning forward or the clerk who had half risen from his seat. She unrolled Edmund's maps on the table with the decisive confidence of a woman who has spent her life in rooms that doubted her and been right in all of them. She said, "Senator Whitmore, the official territorial survey of 1879 places the northern boundary of the Black Rock Corridor at the Clearwater River. My father's survey of the same region, conducted in 1871, places it at Ridge 44. That is a discrepancy of 12,000 acres and 8 miles. I have here the original field instruments, the dated chain measurements, and the survey notes that produced both documents." She looked at Whitmore across the chamber. "I would like the senator to explain to this body how a river moved 8 miles north between 1871 and 1879. Rivers, as the members will know, do not relocate themselves. They relocate when someone needs them to." The chamber went quiet. Rex Dolan stepped forward. He presented his federal credentials with the calm of a man who has been building to this moment for years. He laid out the full investigative record, 3 years of documented evidence, chain of payments, the systematic purchase of county surveyors and territorial officials, the plan to sell the Bitterroot water rights to the Northern Pacific Railway. He read the list of 11 names. When he said Daniel Calloway, Elias did not look away. Whitmore had been watching the room shift. He had watched the journalists in the front row begin writing with the focused urgency of men who understand they are present at something important. He had watched Judge Warren Harris, the senior magistrate of the territorial court, pick up Edmund's maps and examine them with an expression of controlled fury. He had one move left. He drew the pistol from inside his coat. He was fast. He had been fast his whole life. Quick with the move that no one expected because no one expected it from a man in a senator's suit. He aimed at Clara. He said, "You should have stayed in the ravine." Elias was already moving. He said one word, loud and clear, "Left!" Clara stepped left. One step, automatic, immediate, no hesitation. They had drilled that signal on every trail day of the past 2 weeks, the one-word evacuation call, until it was reflex. Whitmore's shot went into the oak pillar where she had been standing. Rex came in from the right side with the efficiency of a man who had been waiting for this exact moment. The tackle was clean. Whitmore went down hard. The pistol skittered across the marble floor. The chamber erupted. Legislators dove for cover or surged toward the doors. The journalists did neither. They kept writing. Elias reached Clara in 4 steps. He put his hands on her face. He said, "Are you hurt?" She said, "No." She was breathing hard, but her eyes were steady. "You?" He said, "No." She said, "Good." She looked past him to where Rex was holding Whitmore on the floor with the assistance of 2 assembly guards who had finally roused themselves. She said, "Is it over?" He said, "It is over." Judge Harris's voice cut through the chamber noise. He was standing at the central table with Edmund's maps in his hands, and his voice, when he used it with full authority, was the kind of voice that made rooms go still. He said, "Garrison Whitmore, you are under arrest by order of the Federal District Court of Montana Territory on charges of fraud, land theft, conspiracy to murder, and the unlawful sale of public water rights." He looked at the assembly guards. "Get him up." Whitmore said nothing. He looked at Clara across the chamber with an expression that was past rage, past calculation. Just the blank look of a man watching the structure of 25 years collapse in an afternoon. Clara looked back at him without flinching. She said, "My father says hello." Then she turned away. She did not look at him again. Outside the assembly hall, in the cold spring air of Helena, the 5 of them stood on the broad stone steps: Elias, Clara, Rex, Cormac, and May. Cormac said, "I believe this calls for whiskey." May said, "It is 10 in the morning." Cormac said, "The occasion supersedes the hour." Rex said quietly to Elias, "I know we are not square." Elias said, "No." Rex said, "Is there a path?" Elias looked at him for a long moment. He thought about 20 minutes. He thought about Daniel, who would have shaken Rex's hand and gone back to work. He thought about the kind of man he was trying to become below the tree line in whatever came next. He said, "There is a path. It is long and it is not straight, and you do not get to know where it ends. But it starts with you finishing what you started." Rex said, "I can do that." Elias said, "Then we will see." May put her arm through Rex's and said, "Come. Your coat is thin and you look like you have not eaten a proper meal in months." She looked up at him. "You look terrible." Rex said, "Hello, Ma." She said, "Hello, Rex." She started down the steps, pulling him with her. "Come along, all of you. I saw a decent-looking dining establishment on the main street, and I intend to spend some of the territorial reward money on a meal that someone else cooked." Cormac said, "May, I have never loved anyone more." They went. Elias and Clara stood on the steps a moment longer. He said, "How is the leg?" She said, "It has been better. It has been considerably worse." She looked out at Helena, the main street busy with ordinary morning commerce, people who did not yet know what had happened in the assembly chamber and would read about it in tomorrow's paper. "It is over. It is actually over." He said, "Yes." She said, "What do we do now?" He said, "May mentioned a dining establishment." She said, "After that." He looked at her. He said, "After that, we go home." She said, "Where is home?" He said, "I have a cabin on the north face of the Bitterroot that needs a second window put in. The south-facing wall gets good morning light. I have been told that someone who draws maps needs good morning light." She said, "Who told you that?" He said, "A very perceptive woman who is standing on these steps." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the mountains visible beyond the edges of Helena, the Bitterroot Range, blue and permanent against the spring sky. She said, "It would need to be a proper window, not just an opening with a shutter." He said, "I can build a proper window." She said, "And a decent work table. My father's maps need a flat surface and good light." He said, "Work table, proper window. Anything else?" She looked at him. She said, "That is enough for now." She took his arm. They walked down the steps toward the street where May and Rex and Cormac had already disappeared in the direction of breakfast, and the spring sun was warm on the stone and the long winter was done. That is the end of the story, and also, in all the ways that matter, the beginning. Whitmore was tried in federal court that summer and convicted on 14 counts. He died in prison 4 years later, having never in all that time said he was sorry for any of it. Some men are built that way. The law handles them regardless. Rex Dolan was formally cleared of all charges against me. He was offered reinstatement in the Federal Investigative Office. He declined it. He stayed in the Bitterroot Valley, which surprised me and which probably should not have. May made Sunday dinner every week without fail. They were learning slowly and without pretending it was easy to be what they should have been. Cormac Donnelly opened a second saloon in Helena the following year. He named it the Callaway without asking my permission. It did excellent business. I complained about the name every time I saw him, which was often. He found this very funny. Some things do not change. The Bitterroot Aquifer was placed under federal protection by Act of the Territorial Legislature in June of 1884, the first such protection granted to a water source in the Northern Territory. Edmund Ashford's name is in the act. It reads, "In recognition of the work of Edmund Ashford, surveyor, who spent 20 years mapping the truth so others could find their way to it." Clara became the first official female surveyor of Montana Territory the following spring. The appointment was not without opposition. She handled the opposition by continuing to be right about the land, consistently and publicly, until the opposition exhausted itself. She is still doing this. She will be doing this when she is 80, I expect. I intend to be there to see it. As for the cabin, we built the south window together in early summer, when the snow was gone and the Bitterroot was green for the first time I could remember caring about it being green. It took 3 days. Clara was a better carpenter than she let on, which she admitted only after the window was in and plumb, and I had noticed. The marks on the pine beam above the door are still there. I did not sand them down. 217 marks, and then nothing. Some things should stay visible. They are a record of where a person stood and what they believed they needed and how wrong they were. I stopped carving them around day 30 of knowing Clara Ashford. I lost track somewhere in the counting, which had never happened to me before. I have thought about why since then, and I think the answer is simple enough. I stopped counting the days of silence because there was no more silence to count. My name is Elias Callaway. I was once a United States Marshal who disappeared into a mountain and stayed there for 5 years because I had run out of reasons to come down. The mountain sent me a reason. She arrived in a blizzard with a broken leg and her dead father's maps against her chest, and a surveyor's eye that could read the ground I had been standing on for 5 years, and tell me things about it I had never seen. She stayed. I intend to spend the rest of my life being worth the survey. This work is a creation of the author's imagination, designed to entertain and provoke thought. Any resemblance to real persons, places, or events is purely accidental. The author assumes no responsibility for interpretations that connect fictional elements to real-world entities.
The story of Elias Callaway and Clara Ashford is not merely a tale of survival in the harsh wilderness, but a profound reflection on redemption, trust, courage, and the enduring power of truth. Set against the unforgiving backdrop of the Bitterroot Mountains, the narrative reveals how isolation can both protect and imprison the human soul, and how connection can ultimately restore what was lost. At its core, the story explores the consequences of grief and guilt. Elias, once a respected U.S. Marshal, retreats into solitude after the death of his brother Daniel and the betrayal by his partner. For 217 days, he lives in silence, convincing himself that withdrawal is a form of survival. Yet, as he admits, many of the things he tells himself are lies. His isolation represents a moral stagnation. He has chosen safety over responsibility, hiding from a world that once needed him. This reflects a key lesson. Avoiding pain does not heal it. It only delays the reckoning. Clara's arrival disrupts this carefully constructed isolation. Despite her injuries, she embodies resilience, intelligence, and purpose. She refuses to be a passive victim, instead, actively pursuing justice for her father. Through her, the story highlights the importance of courage, not the loud, heroic kind, but the quiet determination to continue, even when the odds are overwhelming. Clara teaches Elias that meaningful action requires risk, and that truth is worth fighting for, even at great personal cost. Another central theme is trust. Both Elias and Clara have been shaped by betrayal and loss, making trust difficult. Yet they choose to trust each other anyway. This decision becomes transformative. Elias learns that trust is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. Clara, in turn, insists on mutual respect and shared decision-making, emphasizing that protection should not come at the cost of agency. This is a powerful moral lesson. True partnership is built on equality, honesty, and respect. The story also underscores the value of integrity and perseverance. Edmund Ashford spent 20 years documenting corruption, knowing the danger it posed. Daniel believed in the law even when it failed him. Their sacrifices were not in vain because others chose to carry their work forward. This illustrates that truth may be delayed, but it is not easily destroyed. Justice requires persistence across generations. Finally, Elias's transformation is the emotional heart of the narrative. He moves from isolation to engagement, from guilt to purpose, and from silence to connection. He realizes that life is not about avoiding loss, but about continuing to live meaningfully despite it. The marks he carved to count his days of silence become a symbol of how limited his existence had become, and how freeing it is to stop counting and start living again. In conclusion, the story teaches us that redemption is possible, that truth is worth defending, and that human connection is essential for healing. It reminds us that even in the darkest moments, there is always a path forward if we are willing to take it.